Chapter 17, Lesson 1, Big Business. So now we're going to talk about some stories about how people got really rich and a lot of people did not, and that's in the later part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And this is sometimes called the Gilded Age because there's sort of a shiny level on top, but underneath it's not all that pretty. Andrew Carnegie is one of the great success stories of America. He was a poor Scottish immigrant who came here as a boy and settled in Pittsburgh, went to work in a cotton mill at the age of 13 and was paid $1.25 a week. He taught himself to read and learned a whole lot, saved his money, invested in new companies, and eventually by the time he retired, he was worth $400 million, and basically he dominated the steel industry. Now, a lot of inventions were created in the 1800s in the Americas. Two more important ones we'll get to in a second, but that's obviously Alexander Graham Bell's telephone there. It's hard to imagine the world without that. So two of the major inventors were Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison. This is a picture of Thomas Edison there. And Edison is most well known for inventing the electric light bulb, really sort of tweaked it and made it a bit better. There was other people that were involved in it as well. Some people like Lewis Latimer made it work better with carbon instead of thread, instead of a cotton thread that was used. That made it a lot better. But Edison made a whole lot of interesting inventions, and probably he's also really well known for advocating for direct current instead of alternating current. And actually, we use alternating current today instead of direct current, but there was a big battle about what to use for that. So in many other improvements as well, he created the company that eventually became General Electric, Commonwealth Edison, again, same sort of thing, this idea of those were all related to him as well. Now, Bell created the first telephone. That's an actor portraying as it was used. And he basically does the story about how he was calling for someone in another room and kind of he'd spilled something and was calling in for them to his assistant Watson, and suddenly the invention they'd been working on worked, and his invention, the telephone, eventually becomes the core product that really American Telephone and Telegraph is based on, and that's what AT&T is. And we still have a lot of AT&T is all over the place. Some of these companies got broken up into different things, but AT&T is still around in a lot of ways. But it also has a bunch of other big names that you would probably know if you heard them. So, in the Chicago industry too. So steel making was a major industry. There was a new process of clearing away the bad part of the stuff when people were combining iron and trying to oxygenate it and make it so it would become steel. Steel was really expensive to make because there wasn't a way of doing it in mass amounts. And mass production of steel really started with the Bessemer process, which made it cheaper and easier and made it so that basically you go ahead and get out the carbon that you didn't want in there, the extra carbon. Carnegie started using this in a mill in Pittsburgh, and really he became the leading leader in the industry. And that's the reason why the Pittsburgh Steelers are called Pittsburgh Steelers, because that's where really the industry started there. Steel production increases from the time when he was actually working. It increases from the year 1870 to the year 1900. It goes 147 times as much in the year 1900 as it was in 1870. So obviously that's huge. Carnegie Steel creates a lot of it. When he retired, he actually donated lots and lots of money to libraries, hundreds of millions of dollars to libraries and colleges and things like that. So overall, yeah, that's pretty good way of paying back paying back the country that you were very successful in. Now, John D. Rockefeller was born poor. He figured out a way of making kerosene for fuel, and kerosene was something that had been thrown out previously, and changing it. And then he went into the refining business, and gradually over time, he was a pretty ruthless businessman, but he took over the entire industry. He didn't control all the oil fields. What he controlled was the companies or the plants that made that oil that was taken out of the ground into something useful. And he controlled over 90% of that, so he was able to really affect the price of things. He could then pretty much charge what he wanted for it as well. This idea of monopoly, the game, it's sort of bandied about, and I think that's kind of confusing as to what it is. But the whole idea of monopoly is you want to have a monopoly on all the properties here, and if you do, then everyone else is out of business. And your whole goal is to force everyone out by taking all their money and by forcing them to use your stuff. That's what monopoly is, and that's kind of what a monopoly was back then, except for it was controlling different industries. His company, Rockefeller's company, developed into Standard Oil, and he basically had very little competition. Now this here is a famous image of the Senate, and in behind here you see, this is from a cartoon in the late 1800s, where you see all these guys in the background. These are the guys who are kind of running the Senate. And they're the trusts, the steel beam trust, the copper trust, and different groups here that are kind of in charge. You can say that they're the ones that these guys here, the actual senators, are kind of listening to, which is really sad in some ways in terms of how the government works. A sad commentary on how that happened. Now, one thing that starts becoming more and more important are corporations. Corporations are these large businesses where people own shares. And these big companies like Standard Oil, this is part of a Standard Oil trust certificate, they became really, really powerful and had a major impact on the economy of the country. Now, in terms of one of the responses to all this expansion in terms of factories and other things was that there were more workers in cities. And in cities, many workers worked in these unsafe and unhealthy factories called sweatshops, and that's an image of one there. Many workers were immigrants who accepted really cruddy working conditions because they were just trying to leave their other country and just wanted something new and willing to work for really poor wages and dangerous conditions. And that basically is really sad because this is an example of what happened. There's in New York at one point there was a factory that basically made what were called shirtwaists, which were something having to do with the collar of your shirts. And the problem was that the company did not want people stealing these pieces of fabric, so they locked the doors, and then there was a fire and 147 people died. Some of them jumped off the top floor, and these are actually some of the pictures of the people who jumped off the top floor and died because they had that choice of being burned to death. It's really sad. But in a lot of these sweatshops, people worked 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. They were exposed to really horrible, unsafe chemicals and conditions. Now, workers as old as 10 worked in coal mines and in other businesses too. If you could imagine being your guys' age and already being expected to work in a coal mine, women were also paid a lot less than men. Workers in large factories started organized together into labor unions and fight for better conditions, because the idea was that you can't fire all of us. And we watched that in a video in the having to do with the textile companies, but in the early 1800s. But this also happens more and more in these when there ends up being these large factories. And this is an actual image of the McCormick Reaper McCormick Haymarket riot is what it's called, the Haymarket riot outside the McCormick plant. And this idea was that these guys were speaking out against the practices of the McCormick company. And then what ended up happening was there were police that were called in to break up the strikers, the people who were on strike. And then someone threw a bomb, and some police officers died. And then basically this was this big, huge problem. It was really sad for the police officers, but big crackdown on labor in Chicago. Business owners did not like people who organized unions and frequently fired them. And when workers' demands were not met, they sometimes went out on strike, and sometimes owners called in strike breakers, people that they could hire other than the people who went out on strikes, and sometimes they actually called in gangs to beat up workers. And in some cases, the national government forced people to go back to work. Now, there was one group called the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, and that was started and organized partially by a guy named Samuel Gompers. And the idea was as a group of labor unions would work together, and if there was a problem, that they would all work towards a resolution on that. on that, whatever that issue was. So instead of having different industries having different units, this was sort of a united set of unions. And they got some laws passed that made working conditions better, shorter hours, ended some child labor, and required payment for injuries. If you got injured at work prior to this, you didn't get anything. You probably just got fired because you couldn't work. Now, overall, the economy is changing. There's more and more factories. There's some organization in labor, still a lot of people making a lot of money. Mother Jones, that's Mary Harris Jones. She was a famous and effective union organizer. This is her leading the Children's Crusade March. And some of the laws were eventually changed so people have to be at least 14 before they can actually work. So there's certainly are some progress. In Pennsylvania, that was the rule in 1905. People had to be 14 before they could work. So some progress, but still a long way to go.